Ciao. How are you? Welcome back to Yes. Hi. Long time no see. I was going to pre-record an episode for this past week before I left, but I am a chronic procrastinator and one thing led to another, and the next thing you know, I was still scrambling to make sure that I was leaving for my trip on time. But I had an amazing time. I went to Orcas Island, which is in the San Juan Islands, right off of the Washington State coast. And there's a little village called East Sound that we stayed near, and it's precious. It's like out of a cozy mystery. All the little stores are so cute and everyone knows each other, and I think it's a 2-block radius for the whole thing. And there's a bookstore called Darville's Bookstore that has a cafe inside, and they have these big windows that you can see the bay. Or I'm not sure what it's called, but the little inlet, and it is absolutely gorgeous, and it is hands down one of the top 3 chais, CHAI, chai, that I have had in my entire life. Yes. So if you ever find yourself in Orcas Island, I highly recommend Darville's Bookstore chai. And I have a bunch of other things I could talk about. But moving on, we're moving into spooky season. I'm really excited about it. And to celebrate, I've been making these little ghosts. And they're super cute. These are the 8-inch. This is the 6-inch. And you can get a hair tie or a bow tie, or you can get it non-boonery. So these are both 8-inch. Yeah. And if you would like one, I can make one and send it to you. And they're really great. They have felt on the back, so they're fully covered. They have something like a little loop that you can hang them, and they have ribbon on the outside, and I hand make the bows. Like, they're really, really cute. So these are for sale if someone would like a little ghost to haunt your home. The last thing that I wanted to announce is that my friends and I are hosting a Barbie party on Saturday, September 30th, and it is free for everyone to attend, and it's going to be a really great time. There are badass Barbie babes who are DJing and live art and art that you can purchase, and dancers and performers, tarot readings by yours truly, a story at the end of the night, taco bars, so many things. It's free, and it's Saturday, September 30th, and it's going to be a blast. So I highly recommend that you come out and have a party with us. Come on, Barbie, let's go party. Right. Enough dilly-dallying. We are going to start our book. We are reading The Man Who Was Poe by Avi, and we are just starting part 2. Very ominous. And Edmund was just talking with Mr. Dupin, aka Mr. Poe, who believes he knows the man who murdered the aunt. Chapter 11. Beyond the cemetery gate. An exhausted Edmund remained on the bed staring after Dupin. One moment he was convinced that everything the man said was true. The next he was just as certain it was all mad, the product of drink. The only thing Edmund knew for sure was that he himself didn't know what to think. It was impossible to settle on anything. With a violent shake of his head, he came to a decision. He could no longer bear the agony of confusion. He would put Mr. Dupin to a test. If he went to Mrs. Whitman, as he said he was going to do, Edmund would stay with him. But if Mr. Dupin did not go to the graveyard, if he had lied, he would leave him. He would seek help elsewhere. With a new sense of urgency, Edmund rushed down the steps and onto the street. Though fog and drizzle had turned the day even gloomier, Mr. Dupin was not that hard to spot. The long black coat he wore, his slow, plodding walk, allowed Edmund to follow without himself being seen. But a few blocks beyond Wickenden, on Benefit Street, Edmund began to wonder if he was the only one following the man. Someone else was walking between him and Dupin. Whenever Dupin stopped, which he did a number of times, this person stopped as well. Edmund, wanting to know who it was, quickened his step, but as he drew close, the same fog which had afforded him protection from discovery made it difficult to see who the stranger was. Then, just when he was near enough to see, the figure vanished. Huh! Mystified, Edmund recalled his notion of the night before, that a ghost had been hovering near when he came out of the building. But once again he could almost hear his auntie saying, "Edmund, there's no such thing as ghosts." So when he saw nothing more, not even a shadow, he decided he'd only imagined some stranger. A little beyond the Unitarian Church, Dupin abruptly halted. As far as Edmund could tell, he appeared to be gazing at the back of some large brick buildings which abutted the hill below. Then he turned and looked at the church, studying the fog-shrouded steeple. Dupin pulled out his watch, and after consulting it, took hasty strides back to the church. To Edmund's dismay, he entered. Mr. Dupin had failed the test. He was not going to Mrs. Whitman's. Deeply disappointed, the boy retreated into a doorway across the street. There, eyes on the church entrance, he waited mournfully, hoping against hope that he was wrong about Mr. Dupin. But he began to think about where else he could go, to whom else he might turn. It was dim inside the church, but the light of a few candles set in sconces. Dupin scrutinized its vast space, looking for steps to the steeple. What he saw were rows of pews and lines of prayer books tucked in front railings. The words First Unitarian Church stamped upon them ran from pew to pew like a glimmering thread of gold. Halfway up the empty aisle, Dupin paused, sensing that all about him people were huddled. His heart began beating rapidly. Were these people alive or dead? Unable to find the steeple steps, he retreated anxiously. It was then that he discovered to the left of the entrance the very steps that he wanted. He started up. Dupin climbed until he reached the bell room where the dangling ropes hung in rows. The height made him feel giddy. Alarmed, he grasped one of the ropes for support. The feel of it reminded him of something. Thoughtfully, he stroked the rope with his fingertips, then drew the string he'd found in the bank vault from his pocket. He compared it with the bell rope. It was the same substance. Hemp. Dupin put the string away and gazed through the steeple window down onto Benefit Street. Though the thin rain and growing darkness obscured his view, he was able to make out the same row of buildings he had studied from below. But what he saw now was a narrow cobblestone alley, all but hidden, which ran from Benefit halfway down College Hill. There, against a building, it came to an end. That building, he recognized, from the shape of its singular roof, was the Providence Bank. It would be easy, Dupin saw, for a horse and carriage to go down the alley and to come directly against the rear of the bank. Moreover, if one stood atop the carriage, it would be just as easy to climb onto the bank's roof. Huh! Dupin scanned the roof with meticulous care, searching for the opening of the air shaft which he knew rose from the vault. There he saw it. No grown person could go down that narrow shaft. Ah, thought Dupin, but a child. Just the idea of it made Dupin shudder. A child could be lowered down. That child could then have loaded gold, brick by brick, into a basket, which would be hauled away. Then that same child would have been pulled up too. Nothing would be left. And yet, Dupin reminded himself, two things had been left: a button, and Dupin's fingertips reached for the string. Not string, he told himself, but a bit of rope. Rope used to lower the child down the shaft, which was so much like a deep and narrow grave. Dupin shuddered again. These are my boobies. When Dupin reappeared on the street, Edmund was enormously relieved. But the closer Dupin drew to Mrs. Whitman's house, the more slowly he walked. Edmund hung back. Sometimes Dupin stopped completely as if not sure whether to proceed. Once he did an about-face and started retracing his steps. That sent Edmund scurrying. The next moment, however, showing more determination than ever, the man strode purposefully to Mrs. Whitman's, and once there, he passed down Church Street. Mr. Dupin had done, after all, what he said he would do. Edmund let out a sigh. He felt so much better, in fact, that he made up his mind to go after the information Mr. Dupin wanted about the Lady Liberty. But no sooner did he start to turn than the front door of Mrs. Whitman's house opened. Out burst Catherine, the maid, a coat held about her head and shoulders, and she didn't walk, but rather ran up the street. Watching her, Edmund remembered her hostility. He didn't know the reason for it, but hadn't Mrs. Whitman herself warned him? Now, just as Mrs. Whitman was about to meet Mr. Dupin, Catherine was rushing from the house. Edmund felt it would be a good notion to see where she was going. Catherine hurried up the steep incline of the street called Jenky's. At the corner, she turned and moved along Congdon Street. Then, just before a meeting street, she darted into a large building. Curious but cautious, Edmund studied the sign over its door. The Hotel American House. Dupin stood before the rusty iron gate to the small cemetery. The old burial ground, crowded with gravestones and even a small mausoleum, had been cut from the side of the hill in the space between Mrs. Whitman's house and the rear of a church. A large willow tree, trailing leafless branches, dripped tears of rain like a professional mourner on ground already soggy underfoot. Untrimmed bramble hedges rose on all sides, creating a compressed wilderness. Through the clinging mist, Dupin examined the rear of the house. He wondered if Edmund had understood the message right, that he was to meet her in such a place. Not that he was displeased with the notion, he rather liked it. To speak of love amidst death and decay seemed correct, even proper for him. It fit his mood, his facts, his life. There's actually a scene in the Addams Family Values where Morticia and Gomez are sitting in a cemetery together, and she says, "Midnight, moonlight, surrounded by death." And it's very romantic. But should he or should he not propose to her? Dupin reminded himself that a marriage was a good idea, a necessary one. Normality, stability, money. Once again he vowed to move forward with the plan. Still, he wished he had a drink. Hands trembling, Dupin pushed the cemetery gate open. His boots squashed into the soft ground and made him wonder on whose bones he trod. He approached the mausoleum. It was no more than 5 feet in height, with columns around its central door, and looked like an ancient Roman temple. Dupin decided that if he stood at the mausoleum entrance, it would create the impression that he was just emerging from it. The image, emerging from death, pleased him enormously. The perfect place for Mrs. Whitman to find him. Wasn't that exactly what his love was? Dupin took another step toward the tomb. He stopped, astonished. The temple door was opening, a figure emerging. It was a woman. Her dress was dark, her hair long and fair, her face chalky white, ghost-like. Heart-hammering, Dupin called, "Helen? Is that you?" The woman stood motionless. She seemed to be staring right at him, into him. Dupin took another step forward. Suddenly he realized that it was not Mrs. Whitman, but someone all his senses insisted was a person he had only recently seen. "My children," the figure whispered hoarsely. Dupin's blood ran cold. "Where are my children?" With a gasp, Dupin realized who was standing before him. The woman taken from the bay, the murdered woman. "What have you done with my children?" the woman cried again. She was weeping toward Dupin, reaching at him with long, pale fingers. "Well, I don't have them," Dupin stammered, too horrified to move. "I don't. Give them to me," the woman pleaded, still advancing. Abruptly, she stopped. Her eyes grew wide with terror. She seemed to be looking through Dupin, beyond him. With a scream, she turned and fled into the fog and brambles. Dupin flung himself in the opposite direction, tripping over a fallen gravestone. Regaining his balance, he plunged forward wildly, only to be grasped by huge, powerful hands. "Help!" Dupin screamed. "Help!" Frantically, he twisted about to see who held him. It was Throck. Of course it was. Oh, interesting. Chapter 11 finished on page 111, so 11111. Chapter 12. To see a ghost. One can only hope. Edmund was still standing behind a hedge, watching the entrance of the Hotel American House, when Catherine came rushing out. This time a man was with her. Against the weather he wore a tall hat and a muffler, which all but hid his great spread of whiskers. As Edmund looked on, the two hurried off the same way Catherine had come. Edmund tagged behind, keeping his distance. Suddenly he realized who the man was. It was the one he'd been trying on a coat at the clothier that morning, the very one Mr. Dupin claimed was Mr. Ratchet, his stepfather. Astounded, Edmund stopped short, then came back to his senses just in time to see the two enter Mrs. Whitman's house. Panting for breath, Edmund stood before the closed door, trying to decide what action to take. He could steal back behind the house where he assumed Mr. Dupin was meeting Mrs. Whitman, and tell Mr. Dupin about Mr. Ratchet. Then he remembered the man's words, that he must keep away. The last thing Edmund wanted to do was antagonize him again. No, news of Mr. Ratchet would have to wait while he went in search of information about the Lady Liberty. Resolved, Edmund started off for the docks, but so preoccupied was the boy with thoughts of Mr. Ratchet, he never noticed that since he'd turned his back on the Hotel American House, he himself was being followed. Oh no! "Oh, let me go!" Dupin gasped, trying to wrench free from Throck's iron grip. Here now," the night watchman returned. "It's you who ran into me." All the same, he took his hands from Dupin's shoulders. Set free, Dupin instantly swung about, gazing with terrified eyes through the brambles and fog at the mausoleum. Whatever it was that he had seen had vanished. "Did you see anything?" Throck demanded. He demanded of Throck. "What are you talking about?" the night watchman growled suspiciously. "There!" cried Dupin, pointing where he had seen the figure. "The ghost of a woman, standing before the mausoleum, demanding her children." "I don't see a thing." "There was." "You daft." Dupin, legs shaking, walked back toward the mausoleum, but stopped when he saw that its door was still open. He made a nervous half-turn toward Throck. The night watchman stood a few feet behind, peering at Dupin with intense puzzlement. Dupin pushed himself forward again, edging closer to the tomb. "Is someone there?" he called nervously. All he heard was his own labored breathing and the monotonous dripping of the rain. Fighting against the terror he felt, Dupin climbed the steps to the mausoleum and placed his hand on the door. The cold iron drove a spike of chill through him. Summoning what strength remained to him, he grasped the door handle and pulled. With a rasping, grating sound, the door opened further. Dupin, leaning forward, attempted to look into the dark. The stench of decay brought a wave of nausea. It forced him to back out. Sweating profusely, he clung to the doorframe and leaned forward. "Hello!" he called in a hoarse whisper. "Me!" Only an echo answered. A hoarse whisper. So like a... Never mind. Gradually, his eyes grew accustomed to the dark. There on the floor he saw, long and narrow, what appeared to be a body. With a hammering heart, Dupin crept inside the mausoleum. As he did so, his eyes remained fixed upon the form on the floor. Tentatively, he put his foot forward. There was a soft, crinkling sound. Steeling himself, he touched the object with shaking fingers. It was a straw mattress. As he bent to examine it, Dupin sensed that someone was in the doorway. With a start, he stood up and turned. Throck had followed him into the mausoleum. Dupin recalled the man as he'd first seen him at the docks, hovering over the dead woman. A feeling of dread engulfed him. What are you doing here? He demanded. You're the odd one to be asking that, Throck retorted dryly. What do you mean? Dupin said. Throck, his mouth fixed in a leer, took a step forward, his powerful form completely blocking the way. I seen you in court this morning, he said. You spying on me, weren't you? No, not at all. Two can play this game, can't they? Throck continued. Well, this time I followed you. Not that you knew it. And where do you go? Right to the Providence Bank. That robbery took place, wasn't it? How's that for detail? Then off you go back down to Fox Point to be with the boy. That boy, always that boy, makes a man wonder, makes me wonder, are you his father? I says to myself. Then you come back trailing that boy and stop to take a gander at the back of that same bank. So never mind what I'm doing here. What I'm asking you is this. What are you doing in this abandoned graveyard when no one ever comes? Dupin attempted to draw himself up. I am here to meet someone, he replied. Far as I can see, Throck sneered, you and me, we're alone. Saving the dead, of course. Then they won't help you none. Not now. I don't care what you see, Dupin cried. I'm telling the truth. And what? Throck said, coming further into the crypt. What if I happen not to believe you? Dupin looked for a way past him. As he did, a figure loomed up behind the night watchman. The woman again. There! Dupin screamed, pointing and shrinking back. There! Throck spun around. Is that you, Mr. Poe? Mrs. Whitman asked. Pushing by Throck, Dupin stepped out of the mausoleum. Mrs. Whitman stood at the foot of the steps, gazing up, shawl over her shoulders to protect herself from the drizzle. For a moment, she and Dupin simply looked at each other. Then Dupin, struggling to pull himself together, turned to Throck. You see, he said in a voice not altogether firm, there is a woman. Throck scrutinized Mrs. Whitman. Is this man, he asked, some friend of yours? He is, she replied. And were you to meet him here? I was. Is something the matter? She asked. No, nothing, Dupin quickly answered. I think you may go, he said to Throck. Throck began to speak, but saw Mrs. Whitman's stern eyes upon him and changed his mind. Sullenly, he walked to the gate and out to the street. There he turned and leveled a finger at Dupin. Don't you forget. I'll be watching, he called. Throck sees it through. Dupin kept his eyes upon Throck until the night watchman lumbered out of sight. Then, leaning against the mausoleum door, he tried to calm himself. Mrs. Whitman watched him anxiously. Mr. Poe, she said, what is happening? Why are you looking so ghastly? Who was that dreadful man? And why was he here? No one ever comes here. I can't explain, Dupin replied weakly. You look as if you'd seen a ghost. Dupin started. I have. Mrs. Whitman stood a little straighter. Mr. Poe, she demanded in a shocked but urgent whisper, have you been drinking? Dupin shook his head. Then what is it? I'm in dreadful pain, he said, reaching out. Great pain, please. Give me your hand. Mr. Poe, I've been so alone, so. Mr. Poe, it's not wise for us to remain here. My mother has invited people for tea. They're gathering in the parlor at this very minute. Just a few moments, Dupin begged. He was not sure he could walk even the short distance to the house. Ellen, my life has been miserable without you. Mrs. Whitman took a step toward him, but stopped herself and glanced back over her shoulder. Please, she insisted, we cannot remain here. I can't have scandal. Dupin sighed, closed his eyes, and again held out a hand. "There's so much I need to tell you." Mrs. Whitman began to reach toward him. "I sent you a note last night," he said. Her hand halted. "I never received it," she said. Dupin opened his eyes. "My mother intercepted it," Mrs. Whitman explained, "but you mustn't say anything about it. Now, please, Mr. Poe, take possession of yourself and come with me to the house. And be warned, we will be surrounded by enemies." So saying, she forced herself to turn about and walk up the path toward the rear door of the house. Dupin, pausing only to look wonderingly back at the mausoleum, followed. All right, my friends, that concludes our reading for the evening. That was chapters 11 and chapter 12. And Mr. Dupin has just seen a ghost of the children's mother in the grave. And he's about to attend a dinner full of enemies. What does that mean? A lot of questions. The story seems to be moving forward at a nice pace. Thank you for being here. I hope that you have a magical week. I hope something amazing happens to you. If you would like to purchase handmade little ghosts, 6 inches or 8 inches, bow tie or hair bow, or non-boonery, white or natural rope, just let me know. If you would like a tarot reading, house clearing, curse cleansing, etc., witch shit, also let me know. I got you. And yes, I don't have anything else to add, so we're going to conclude with our typical, our usual send-off. A little love, a little peace, and stay spooky. I love you.